Dawn broke gray over the plantation kitchen. The little slave girl carried a water bucket from the well, her bare feet finding the worn path without thinking. The bucket was heavy, sloshing slightly with each step, and the metal handle bit into her palms. She'd made this walk 1,000 times before sunrise, after sunset, whenever water was needed. Inside the kitchen, the overseer stood with two field hands. Their voices were low but urgent, the kind of talk that meant trouble was coming. The girl set the bucket down carefully on the wooden table, keeping her eyes on the floor. Her hands didn't shake, but her chest went tight. She knew how to be invisible, how to move through a room without being noticed, how to listen without seeming to hear. 3 pastors, the overseer said. His voice was sharp, clipped, caught holding secret meetings, teaching slaves to read, preaching what the governor calls rebellion. One field hand, a man with gray in his beard and scars on his back from 20 years of work, shook his head slowly. When, week's end, public hanging, governor's orders came down yesterday, the girl picked up a tin cup from the shelf and dipped it into the bucket. The water was cold, clean, pulled from deep in the earth where it stayed cool even in summer heat. Where? The other field hand asked. He was younger, stronger, with hands that could break wood or mend it depending on what was needed. Execution yard, behind the courthouse. They're raising the gallows now. Should be finished by tomorrow. The girl filled the cup slowly, her movements deliberate. Dates, places, names she recognized from Sunday services, and the plantation owner let them gather for prayer. Pastor Williams, Pastor Green, Pastor Thomas. Men who'd baptized babies and buried the dead and spoken words that made people feel like they were worth something beyond the price on a bill of sale. Confusion hardened into dread. Faith itself was on trial. Belief had become a crime punishable by rope and air, and a crowd gathered to watch. Outside, carpenters' hammers rang toward the yard, steady, deliberate, the sound of men building the structure that would end 3 lives. Thud, 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 like a heartbeat made of wood and nails. The girl carried the cup to the overseer. He took it without looking at her, without saying thank you, because children like her weren't owed thanks. She stepped back to her corner and picked up a rag to wipe the table, but her ears stayed sharp. They say it'll be quick, the younger field hand said. Drop and done. Nothing about hanging is quick, the older one muttered. Rope burns, body fights, takes minutes sometimes. The overseer shot him a hard look. Keep talk like that to yourself. Governor wants order, wants to make an example. Last thing we need is sympathy making people foolish. The men fell silent. The girl kept wiping the table, moving the rag in slow circles, but inside her mind was racing. 3 men, week's end, gallows already being built. She thought about the sermons she'd heard, about Moses and freedom, about Daniel in the lion's den, about faith that moved mountains and parted seas, but she'd never seen faith stop a rope. That night in the slave quarters, the air was thick and close. The cabins were small, rough-built, with gaps in the walls where wind came through in winter and mosquitoes in summer. 20 people shared the space, men, women, children pressed together on pallets and bare floor. The preacher's wife gathered a small group near the back wall. Her name was Sarah, though most just called her sister. Her husband was one of the 3 condemned men. Her face was lined with grief, but her back was straight, and her voice was steady. Her child sat close, a boy maybe 6 years old who didn't fully understand why his father wouldn't be coming home. The girl was allowed to stay because she was quiet and quick and knew how to carry messages without being seen. Because she could be trusted, Sister Sarah began to sing, low, steady. A hymn the girl had heard in church, but never like this, with pauses that meant something, with verses that sounded like directions instead of praise. When the sun sets behind the oak, look for the door that opens twice. Count the bells until they rest, then move when silence holds the night. Double quotes. The girl listened, her whole body tuned to the sound. She matched pitch perfectly, something she'd always been able to do, like her ears heard music differently and other people's. She memorized not just the words but the spaces between them. The rhythm, the way certain syllables got held longer than others. The way Sister Sarah's voice dipped on door and rose on twice. This wasn't just a hymn. It was code, instructions wrapped in melody. Dogs outside had been pacing, restless, their chains rattling as they prowled the perimeter the overseer had set. That as the hymn held steady, as the tempo evened out and the pitch stayed true, the dog settled, lay down, went quiet. Fear softened into resolve through song. The girl felt it in her chest, something stronger than panic, something that could be carried and used, not magic, not miracle. Just the simple fact, at rhythm calm, animals and people alike, that music could make a space feel safer even when nothing had changed. The hymn faded, but the rhythm stayed in her chest like a second heartbeat. Sister Sarah looked at her, just for a moment, and nodded. The girl nodded back. She understood. The hymn was a map. A way to move through darkness without getting lost. A way to know which doors were safe and which roads led to patrols with dogs and guns. Outside, an owl called. Once, twice, then silence. 2 days later, the girl was sent on an errand to the clerk's office with a message from the overseer. The town was 3 miles from the plantation, close enough to walk but far enough that the journey took most of the morning. She walked the dirt road with bare feet, feeling every stone and rut. A wagon passed, kicking up dust that made her cough. The driver didn't look at her, didn't slow down. She was just another slave child on an errand, invisible as air. The courthouse sat at the center of town, a 2-story building with white columns and a bell tower. The clerk's office was attached to the side, a smaller structure with a narrow door and windows that caught the morning light. Inside, the clerk sat at his desk stamping passes for travelers and workers who needed permission to move between districts. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous way of glancing at the door like he expected trouble to walk through any moment. The girl handed him the folded note from the overseer and waited while he read it. His lips moved slightly as he decoded the overseer's cramped handwriting. On the desk lay a fresh pass, ink still drying, wax seal pressed into the corner. The girl's eyes caught the wax while the clerk read. It was darker than it should be. Not the bright red she'd seen on official courthouse documents when she'd delivered messages before, but a duller shade, almost brown, like rust or old blood. A patroller stood by the door, waiting for the pass. He was a big man with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. When the clerk handed him the pass, the patroller glanced at it barely a second, waved the traveler through without looking closely, and turned back to his conversation with another guard. Unease became certainty. Papers were lying. Seals were wrong. Authority was being forged, and no one was checking closely enough to notice. The clerk finished reading the overseer's note and scribbled a reply. He folded it, pressed his seal into wax, and handed it to the girl. "Tell him I'll have the accounts ready by Friday," the clerk said. "Yes, sir." She took the note and left, but the image of that wrong-colored seal stayed burned in her mind. The seal cooled on the page, dull and wrong, and she knew somehow, without being told, that this mattered. That the color of wax could mean the difference between legal and fraud, between justice and murder. The next afternoon, she passed the execution yard with the old stable hand. His name was Joshua, though most people just called him Old Josh. He'd been sent to deliver tools to the carpenters building the gallows, and the girl had been sent to carry water for the workers. The gallows stood half-finished against the gray sky. Thick beams raised vertical, crossbeam laid horizontal, the whole structure towering over the dusty yard like a monument to cruelty. Ropes lay coiled at the base, 3 of them, thick as a man's wrist, rough hemp that would burn skin and crush windpipe. One rope brushed the girl's ankle as she stepped past, and the fibers scratched her skin like a warning. She flinched but didn't stop walking. Old Josh stopped, though. His face went gray. His hands, which had held horses steady through storms and sickness, trembled. "Daylight will end all questions," he whispered. His voice was rough, barely audible. No trial, no appeal, no chance to speak, just rope and air and a crowd watching men die. The girl stared at the cold ropes. They looked like sleeping snakes, patient, waiting. Helplessness deepened into quiet defiance. She didn't know what she could do, didn't know how a child with no power and no voice could stop 3 men from hanging, but standing still and watching felt like dying before the rope ever tightened. Felt like surrendering to the idea that some lives didn't matter, that some voices deserved silencing. She set down the water bucket and picked up the rope that had touched her ankle. It was heavy, coarse, made for breaking, not bending. "Put it down, child," Old Josh said quietly. "Don't let them see you touching it." She dropped the rope and picked up her bucket. But as they walked away from the half-built gallows, she made a decision. She didn't know what yet, didn't know how. But she wouldn't just watch, wouldn't just carry water and keep her head down while 3 men died for preaching truth. The hammers rang behind them, steady and relentless, counting down to Friday dawn. That evening, She was sent to the church basement to help sort supplies for the poor. The church was a simple wooden building with a cross on top and benches inside that seated maybe 50 people. The basement smelled like earth and old wool, and it stayed cool even in summer heat. The preacher was there, not one of the condemned men, but another pastor who served the white congregation and quietly helped the enslaved when he could. His name was Reverend Matthews. He was tall, with gray at his temples and hands scarred from years of carpentry work before he'd been called to ministry. Two helpers worked with him, sorting quilts and organizing ledgers for the circuit court's review. The church kept records, births, deaths, marriages that sometimes mattered when freedom papers were disputed or families were sold apart. Reverend Matthews hummed as he worked. The same hymn from the corridors, but with different verses, ones the girl hadn't heard Sister Sarah sing. When the door is barred, look to the window on the left. Count 3 bells, then move when the fourth is silent. Turn your face toward the oak, not the willow where they wait. The girl folded a quilt, thick, heavy, stitched by hand in patterns of blue and brown. As she ran her hands over the fabric, smoothing the folds, she noticed something in the binding. Stitching that didn't match the rest, tiny, deliberate, too precise to be decoration. She traced it with her finger. Letters, words formed by thread laid over thread in a pattern that would look like nothing to most people, but read clear as writing to anyone who knew what to look for. Left at fork, right at creek. Safe house 3 doors past church. Discovery sparked hope. The hymn wasn't just comfort, it was code. And the quilts were carrying messages that couldn't be burned or torn without someone noticing the destruction. Maps sewn into fabric, directions stitched where patrols wouldn't think to look. She glanced at Reverend Matthews. He was watching her, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "You see it?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Some things need seeing. Some truths hide in plain sight, waiting for eyes that know how to look." Lantern lights swung as one of the helpers moved across the basement, and the stitches seemed to speak in the shifting shadows. The girl traced the pattern again, memorizing the route, storing it the way she'd stored the hymn's rhythm and the color of the wrong seal. Everything was connected: hymns, quilts, seals, whispers in kitchens, and hammers in execution yards. A web of information that could save lives or end them depending on who knew what and when. "Can I ask something, sir?" the girl said. "You can ask the pastors who are going to hang." "Can anything stop it?" Reverend Matthews's jaw tightened. "I don't know, child. I've been praying. We've all been praying. But prayer don't always stop rope, and faith don't always move governors." "What about proof?" the girl asked. "What if the papers that charged them were wrong? What if the seals were forged?" The Reverend's eyes sharpened. "What do you know about seals?" "I know the courthouse uses bright red wax, official stamp. But I've seen passes with darker wax, wrong color. And patrollers don't check close enough to notice." Reverend Matthews set down the ledger he'd been holding. "If papers were forged, if charges were brought under false authority, that would void the sentence. But proving it would take testimony from the clerk. And clerks don't usually risk their necks for enslaved people or the pastors who preach to them. What if there's something written?" The girl pressed. "Something that says the pastors should be protected. Where would something like that be written?" The girl hesitated. She didn't know yet. But the plantation owner's fevered words kept echoing in her mind. "Written where no one looks." "I don't know, sir, but I'm going to find out." The overseer came to the quarters the next night with guards and torches. His face was hard, his jaw set, and when he kicked open the first cabin door, everyone inside froze. "Searches," he announced, his voice loud enough to carry across the whole compound. "Looking for evidence of conspiracy. Any Bibles with marks, any quilts with clever stitching, anything that looks like teaching or planning or organizing." He kicked over a trunk in the first cabin and scattered its contents across the dirt floor: clothes, a wooden cup, a carved figure some child had made from a stick. Nothing that mattered, but the overseer treated it all like evidence of rebellion. "If I find lies," he shouted, turning to address everyone who'd come to their doorways to watch, "I burn it all. Every Bible, every quilt, every scrap of paper. You hear me?" Everyone heard. The children pressed close to their mothers. The older folks kept their faces smooth, empty of reaction, because showing fear or anger would only make things worse. The girl stood in the doorway of her cabin, her heart pounding but her face calm. She'd already moved the stitch strip from the quilt binding earlier that evening. She'd cut it carefully with a knife borrowed from the kitchen, trimmed the edges so it wouldn't fray, and hidden it inside her bracelet, a piece of cloth tied at her wrist that she wore all the time. It looked like nothing important, just decoration. Just a child's way of making herself feel pretty. The overseer moved from cabin to cabin, his torch flaring in the darkness, throwing wild shadows across the walls. He was looking for something specific, something he could use to justify harsher measures, to prove that the enslaved were conspiring with the condemned pastors, to make the hangings look necessary, instead of cruel. He reached the girl's cabin, stepped inside. His eyes swept the small space, one pallet, one blanket, a wooden box that held her few belongings. He kicked the box open. Inside, a comb with missing teeth, a piece of mirror no bigger than her palm, a stub of candle. The overseer's torch came close to where the quilts were stacked. Too close, the girl's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't let her eyes flick toward her wrist where the stitch strip was hidden. Fear was mastered by stillness. She'd learned that years ago. Movement drew attention, reaction invited cruelty. The safest thing was to become stone. The overseer grabbed a quilt, shook it hard, squinted at the binding. But he was looking for something obvious, words written in ink, messages sewn in letters big enough to read at a glance. The tiny thread work that formed directions was too subtle, too small. He saw nothing but decoration. He threw the quilt down and moved to the next cabin. The torch flared, then moved on, taking its thread with it. When he finally left, when all the cabins had been searched and nothing useful found, the quarters exhaled together. Slowly, carefully, still not quite believing they were safe. The girl sat on her pallet and pressed her hand to her wrist, feeling the hidden strip beneath the cloth bracelet. Her heart was still racing, but her hands were steady. She'd kept the map, kept the proof, and tomorrow she'd figure out what to do with it. 2 days before the scheduled execution, the plantation owner collapsed with fever. It happened in the afternoon, sudden and violent. One moment he was reviewing accounts in his study, the next he was on the floor, convulsing, sweat pouring off him like he'd been caught in a rainstorm. His wife screamed for help, servants came running. Someone was sent for the doctor, but the nearest physician was 10 miles away and wouldn't arrive until evening at the earliest. The midwife was called. Her name was Aunt Ruth, and she delivered half the babies in the county, white and black both, and tended the sick when doctors were too far or too expensive. She was a small woman with strong hands and a face that had seen too much death to be frightened by it. She came with her basket of herbs and her steady presence. The girl went with her, carrying water and holding the lamp, doing whatever was needed. They set up in the owner's bedroom. The man lay on a 4-poster bed with fine linens, but all the wealth in the world couldn't stop the fever shaking his body or the chills that made his teeth chatter. Aunt Ruth worked quickly. She had the girl boil water over the bedroom fire, then added herdsmint for the lungs, pine for strength, willow bark for fever. Steam rose from the pot, thick and medicinal, filling the room with a sharp, clean smell. Hold the pot steady, Aunt Ruth instructed. Direct the steam toward his face. He needs to breathe it. The girl held the pot, careful not to spill, angling it so the steam rose toward the man's nose and mouth. But he was too agitated. His breathing was jagged, panicked, like he was drowning in air. His eyes rolled back, his hands clutched at the sheets. The girl started singing, soft, low, the hymn from the quarters, slowed to the tempo of a resting heartbeat, the same rhythm that had quieted the dogs and steadied Sister Sarah's voice. When darkness falls and fear takes hold, remember breath is steady gold, she made up the words as she went, keeping the melody true, keeping the tempo even, in, out, like waves on a shore. Like a mother rocking a child, the owner's wild eyes found hers. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he seemed to see her, really see her, not as property or servant, but as a person, as someone trying to help. She kept the rhythm going, kept singing, kept guiding his breathing with the sound. Slowly, so slowly, his gasping eased, his shaking lessened. His breath began to match the tempo of her song. Mercy opened a door pride had kept shut. The man who owned her, who could sell her, whip her, work her until she dropped, was being calmed by her voice, saved by her steadiness. His breath steadied with the song, and Aunt Ruth nodded approval. Good child, you got a gift, keep it going while I work. The girl kept singing while Aunt Ruth applied cool cloths to the owner's forehead, while she checked his pulse and his pupils, while she administered willow bark tea, one careful spoonful at a time. By the time the doctor arrived that evening, the crisis had passed. The owner was sleeping, pale, exhausted, but alive. The doctor examined him and pronounced that the worst was over. "Whatever you did," he told Aunt Ruth, "keep doing it." Later that night, when the household had settled and most people had gone to bed, the girl sat watching a chair beside the owner's bed. Aunt Ruth had gone to rest, trusting the girl to call if anything changed. The owner slept fitfully, his breathing still uneven but no longer dangerous. Lamplight flickered across his face, throwing shadows that made him look older, frailer, more human than the figure of authority he usually presented. Around midnight, he stirred. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused, fever-bright. He murmured something. The girl leaned closer. "The oath," he whispered. His voice was barely there, rough as gravel. "Written where no one looks. Margin. Protect them. Double quotes." The girl's heart stopped. "Protect who, sir?" "Pastors, clause, in the Bible. Margin writing. No one knows. Only me and the clerk. Wrong seal. They're using wrong seal. Double quotes." His words trailed off into mumbling, then silence as sleep took him again. But the girl had heard enough. Purpose replaced fear. There was something written, something hidden, something that could change what was coming. Friday dawn. She sat back in the chair, her mind racing. The Bible, margin writing, a clause about protecting the pastors, and something about a wrong seal, the same wrong seal she'd seen at the clerk's office. Night deepened as she carried the words with her, turning them over in her mind like stones polished smooth by water. She didn't sleep, just sat and watched and planned, waiting for the household to wake so she could find what the owner had hidden where no one thought to look. The girl waited until the house was fully quiet, until even the owner's wife had retired to the guest room and the servants had finished their evening tasks. The lamp in the owner's bedroom burned low, and his breathing had evened into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. She rose from the chair slowly, testing each floorboard with her toe before putting her full weight down. The old house creaked and settled at night, and she needed to move without adding to the chorus of sounds that might wake someone. The owner's study was 2 doors down the hall. She'd been inside before to clean, to deliver messages, to stand silent while he conducted business, but she'd never been alone in it, never had the freedom to look closely at what the room held. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside and closed it behind her with a soft click that sounded loud as thunder in the midnight quiet. Moonlight came through the window, silver and cold, enough to see by without lighting a candle that might draw attention. The study smelled like pipe, tobacco and old paper, leather and ink, and the particular mustiness of books that had sat on shelves for decades. The Bible sat on a shelf between a ledger and a copy of Blackstone's commentaries. It was leather-bound, larger than the Bibles used in church, with pages edged in gold that caught the moonlight. She lifted it carefully and carried it to the desk where the light was better. The book was heavy, substantial, the kind of weight that spoke of importance and authority. She opened it carefully, flipping through pages, looking for margins with cramped writing. Genesis nothing, Exodus there. In the white space beside the verses about Moses and justice and the laws given on the mountain, she found tiny script pressed into the margin in ink that had faded to brown but was still legible. "Let it be known that protection is granted to those who preach truth without rebellion, provided their words are witnessed by proper authority under seal of the circuit clerk." Bright red, official stamp, no deviation permitted. Any charge brought under false papers bearing wrong seal is void and punishable as fraud. This clause applies to all preachers named herein who serve in good faith: Reverend Josiah Williams, Reverend Marcus Green, Reverend Samuel Thomas. Witness this day by my hand and oath. The owner's signature followed, along with a date from 3 years prior, before the debts had gotten bad, before the governor had started cracking down on gatherings, before fear had turned faith into a crime. 3 names, the 3 pastors scheduled to hang. Shock became resolve. This wasn't just a promise or a personal note. This was a legal clause, a protection written and signed by the man who owned most of the land in the county, whose word carried weight in court, whose oath mattered to magistrates and judges. And someone had tried to bury by using the wrong seal on the charging documents. The girl's thumb pressed against the margin, and the ink stained her skin a brown smudge that looked like she'd touched rust or old blood. She rubbed it, but it didn't come off easily. The stain would fade in time, but for now it marked her as someone who'd touched something that mattered. She closed the Bible carefully and returned it to the shelf exactly as she'd found it. Then she slipped out of the study, down the hall, back to the owner's bedroom where she sat in the chair and tried to calm her racing heart. She had the information, had the proof. Now she needed to figure out what to do with it. Outside, an owl called. The night pressed close. And somewhere 3 miles away, carpenters were putting finishing touches on a gallows that would be ready by dawn Friday. The next morning, she found old Josh near the barn. He was mending harness leather, his gnarled fingers working the all-end thread with practiced precision. "Need to talk," the girl said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. Old Josh didn't look up from his work, but his hands slowed. "Talk fast. Overseers watching everyone close these days. There's something written in the owner's Bible, a protection clause for the 3 pastors. Says any charges brought under the wrong seal are void." Now old Josh looked up. His eyes were sharp despite his age. "You saw this yourself?" "Yes. Last night. Owner mentioned it when he was fevered. I found it in the Exodus margin. And the seal. I've seen the wrong seal at the clerk's office. Dark red wax instead of bright red. The patrollers don't check close enough to notice, but it's there." Old Josh set down the harness and wiped his hands on his pants. "We need to reach the clerk, get him to testify. But the clerk's office is 3 miles, and dogs are released on the roads after dark. Patrols doubled since the pastors were arrested. I know how to quiet the dogs." He raised an eyebrow. "How?" "The hymn. Same one Sister Sarah sings. Same tempo I use to calm the owner's breathing. Dogs settle, and the pitch is right. Something about the frequency makes them calm instead of alert." Old Josh considered this. He'd worked with animals all his life: horses, mules, dogs, oxen, and he knew that sound affected them in ways people didn't always understand. A steady tone, a particular rhythm, it could calm a spooked horse or settle a nervous dog. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, after the patrols change. Midnight to 2 in the morning. That's when they're thinnest on the ground, tired from day shift. Not yet alert for dawn shift. You're just a child, old enough to see what needs doing. Old enough to carry proof." Old Josh nodded slowly. "I'll come with you. Can't let you walk 3 miles alone in the dark, not with what you're carrying." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We might get caught, might get wet, might get sold south for running in the night, might save 3 men from hanging." Old Josh smiled, small, tired, but genuine. "Might at that." They left just after midnight. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to see by, but that worked in their favor. Darkness hid as much as it hindered. The girl had changed into darker clothes, a worn shift that wouldn't catch moonlight. Old Josh wore his work clothes, pants and shirt so patched and faded they blended into shadow. They moved along the edge of the fields, keeping to the tree line where possible, avoiding the open road where patrols might spot them. The night was warm, humid, full of the sounds of crickets and frogs and small animals moving through underbrush. When they were about a mile from the plantation, dogs started barking in the distance. The patrol kennels. Big dogs, trained to track and attack, released at night to discourage anyone from moving without permission. Old Josh tensed. "Dogs are out." The girl started humming, low, steady, the hymn from the quarters, pitched to match the frequency it had calmed the animals before. When darkness falls and fear takes hold, the barking in the distance grew louder for a moment, then began to fade. The dogs' voices dropped from aggressive alarm to confused inquiry, then to silence. Old Josh glanced at the girl with something like wonder. "I'll be damned. Don't curse," she said automatically, still humming. "Sorry. But I've never seen dogs settle like that from a song. It's not magic. Just sound, frequency. Something about the pitch makes them calm." They kept walking, and the girl kept humming, adjusting the pitch when she heard dogs stirring in the distance. Every time they approached a patrol point, she'd hum a little louder, a little steadier, and the dogs would quiet, danger bend under calm courage. The girl kept her breathing even, kept the hymn steady, and felt the night open around them like a path that had been waiting. They reached Reverend Matthews's house just after 1 in the morning. It was a small cabin behind the white church, simple but sturdy, with a garden out front and a single window that showed lamplight. Old Josh knocked soft, deliberate, 3 times, pause, twice more. A signal that meant friend, not threat. The door opened a crack. Reverend Matthews stood there in his nightshirt, holding a candle, his face sprayed until he recognized them. "What's wrong?" he asked, opening the door wider. "Need to talk," Old Josh said. "About the pastors, about proof." They stepped inside. The cabin was neat, spare a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and papers. The Reverend's wife was asleep behind a curtain that divided the space. The girl pulled the Bible margin information from her memory and told him everything, the owner's fevered words, the clause she'd found, the 3 names, the seal color requirement. Reverend Matthews listened without interrupting, his face growing more intent with each detail. When she finished, he sat heavily in one of the chairs. This changes everything. If the papers used to charge the pastors were sealed with the wrong wax, the charges are void under the owner's own written clause. That's what I thought, the girl said. But we need the clerk to testify, need him to bring the seals, both of them, and show the difference publicly. Need him to confirm that the forged seal has been used on official documents. Old Josh shook his head. Clerk won't risk it. He's got family, got threats hanging over him. Why do you think he's been so nervous lately? Reverend Matthews stood and went to a small trunk under his bed. He opened it and pulled out a piece of cloth, a ribbon, thin and fray, marked with a wax impression. This is the forged seal, he said, holding it up to the candlelight. I've been collecting proof for months. Every time I see a pass or document with the wrong color wax, I make a note. Sometimes I can get a sample, like this ribbon that was sealed and then discarded. He turned it so they could see the wax impression clearly. Dark red, almost brown, the same color the girl had seen at the clerk's office. The clerk is good man, Reverend Matthews continued. Scared, but good. He knows what's happening. Knows the seals are being forged. But he's been threatened, told if he speaks up, his family will suffer. Then how do we get him to testify? The girl asked. We show him he's not alone, that we have proof too. That enough people know the truth, that staying silent won't protect him anymore, it'll just make him complicit. Faith became strategy. The network wasn't just about comfort or coded hymns. It was about gathering evidence, connecting people who had pieces of the truth, building a case that could stand in daylight even when powerful people wanted it buried. Reverend Matthews pressed the ribbon into the girl's palm. Keep this with you. When the time comes, when we have the clerk in front of witnesses, you show this. You name the color difference. You speak the truth calmly, clearly, so everyone can hear. I'm just a child. Why would anyone listen to me? Because children don't usually lie about wax colors. Because your voice will carry weight, precisely because you're not supposed to have one. Because sometimes the truth comes from the least likely mouth, and that's what makes people pay attention. The girl closed her fingers around the ribbon, feeling the slight texture of the wax impression against her skin. The hymn, she said, Sister Sarah taught me. It maps safe doors and dangerous crossings. It does, Reverend Matthews confirmed. Every verse is a direction. Every pause means something. It's how we've been moving people through the county without getting caught. How we've been communicating without paper that can be seized and read. Can you teach me more verses? He smiled. I can teach you enough to get where you need to go, but first we need a plan. The execution is Friday dawn. Today is Wednesday. We have less than 2 days. The next day brought a complication. A new patroller captain arrived in the district, transferred from the coast where he'd made a reputation for catching runaways and breaking up gatherings. His name was Captain Reeves, and he was younger than most patrollers, harder, with eyes that looked for guilt instead of innocence. He rode through the plantation in the afternoon, his horse kicking up dust, his rifle prominently displayed across his saddle. The overseer met him at the main house. The girl was working in the kitchen garden, close enough to overhear their conversation. I'm tightening security, Captain Reeves announced. His voice was clipped, authoritative. Governor's orders. No movement after dark without written tasks. No gatherings of more than 3 enslaved people without white supervision. Anyone caught breaking these rules gets whipped first, questioned second. We've been following protocol, the overseer said defensively. Not closely enough. I've reviewed the documents from this district. Too many passes issued, too many errands that happen at convenient times. It stops now. The girl kept her hands busy pulling weeds, but her mind was racing. Tighter security, more checks. This was about the pastors, about making sure no one could organize support or gather evidence before Friday's execution. That afternoon, she was sent to town with a message for the seamstress. On the way back, Captain Reed stopped her at a road crossing. "Tass," he demanded. She didn't have one. The errand had been short, and the overseer hadn't bothered with paperwork for a quick trip. "No pass, no crossing," Captain Reed said flatly. The girl looked up at him, keeping her face respectful but her voice steady. "Sir, the passes from the courthouse use bright red wax, official seal." If you see any other color darker red, almost brown, that means the paper's not legal. It's forged. His eyes narrow. How would you know that? Because I carry messages. I see documents. I know the difference between official seals and wrong ones. For a moment, Captain Reeves's confidence flickered. A slave child speaking with certainty about official procedures wasn't normal. It suggested someone was teaching her, someone with access to documents and seals and legal language. Who told you this? He asked. No one told me, sir. I just see what's in front of me. Notice things. The courthouse seal is bright red, always has been. Any other color means something's wrong with the paper, authority faltered. The patroller's hand loosened on his reins, and his horse shifted under him, sensing his uncertainty. He could arrest her, could drag her back to the overseer and demand an investigation. But arresting a child for knowing the color of official seals would raise questions he might not want to answer, especially if he'd been waving through passes with the wrong wax and hadn't noticed. Go, he said finally. But you're on notice, I'll be watching. She crossed the road and kept walking, her heart pounding but her face calm. Behind her, she heard Captain Reeves ride away, his horse's hooves hitting the ground harder than necessary. She'd rattled him, made him doubt, and doubt was a crack that truth could widen. That evening, she tried to reach the clerk's office, but neighbors said he'd left town. Family emergency, they claimed, gone to the next county. Won't be back until after the weekend. Time was running out. The execution was scheduled for Friday dawn, less than 36 hours away. Hope dipped toward despair. Without the clerk's testimony, without the two seals side by side showing the difference, the margin clause would stay hidden. The pastors would hang. The forged papers would stand unchallenged. The girl stood outside the locked clerk's office, staring at the door, feeling the weight of the ribbon in her bracelet and the knowledge in her head and the absolute impossibility of making anyone listen. In the distance, the courthouse bell tolled the daily signal that court was in session, that justice was being served, that law and order prevailed. But what kind of justice used forged seals? What kind of order silenced truth? She walked back toward the plantation as the sun set, painting the sky orange and red colors that reminded her of fire and blood and the wax that wasn't quite right. Old Josh was waiting near the barn. He took one look at her face and knew. Clerk ran, she said. Figured he might. Too scared to stay. Then what do we do? Old Josh looked toward the execution yard, visible in the distance beyond the town. The gallows stood finished now, dark against the sunset, 3 nooses hanging ready. We pray, he said quietly. And we trust that truth finds a way even when the path looks closed. That night, the girl couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet in the quarters, listening to people breathe around her, listening to the night sounds outside, and felt desperation pressing down like a physical weight. She thought about Sister Sarah, whose husband would hang if nothing changed. Thought about the other 2 pastors, men with families, with congregations, with voices that had spoken hope into places where hope was scarce. She thought about the gallows, the rope, the drop, the minutes it would take to die, and she thought about the margin clause and the forged seal and the clerk who'd run rather than stand. Around midnight, she drifted into something between sleep and waking. A vision, maybe, or a dream so vivid it felt real. She saw the execution yard, the gallows standing tall, rope swaying in wind that hadn't come yet. A crowd gathering, the pastors being led forward. Then she saw a bend in the road behind the yard, a place where trees grew thick and the path curved out of sight. A figure stood there, half hidden in shadow, holding papers. The dream shifted. Lightning split the sky, sudden, violent, without storm clouds or warning. Wood splintered, the gallows collapsed, voices rose in him so loud the ground seemed to shake. She saw herself standing in the yard, holding a lantern that wasn't lit, and people turning toward her like she was the source of light even in full day. The vision ended. She woke with her heart racing, sweat on her forehead despite the cool night air. Fear yielded to trusting guidance. She didn't understand what she'd seen. Didn't know if it was prophecy or hope or her mind trying to solve a problem her waking thoughts couldn't answer. But she knew one thing. She needed to be at the execution yard Friday morning. Needed to stand where she could be seen. Needed to carry the proof even if she didn't yet know how it would be used. Whatever was going to happen, however truth was going to break through, she had a part to play. Thursday dawned clear and hot. The girl went through her tasks with mechanical precision. Her mind elsewhere, she carried water, pulled weeds, scrubbed floors, delivered messages. All the while, She felt time ticking down toward Friday dawn. That afternoon, Reverend Matthews came to the plantation on church business officially to discuss a baptism, but really to coordinate with those who knew about the margin clause and the forged seal. He met with old Josh and the girl behind the barn, where they wouldn't be overheard. "The clerk is scared," Reverend Matthews said without preamble. "But I got a message to him. Told him we have proof. Told him he needs to decide whether he wants to be remembered as the man who let 3 innocent people hang, or the man who stood for truth when it cost him something. Will he come?" Old Josh asked. "I don't know. But we're going to the execution yard tomorrow. You, me, the girl. We're going to position ourselves where we can be seen. We're going to carry the proof, the ribbon, the knowledge of the margin clause, the certainty that the seals don't match. And if the clerk doesn't show," the girl asked, "then we speak anyway. We tell anyone who'll listen. We name the forgery loudly enough that it can't be ignored." He pulled out a small lantern, old, dadder, with a broken shutter that wouldn't stay closed. "Carry this tomorrow. Don't light it. Just hold it. When the moment comes, lift it high. Let people see you're holding light even when there's no flame." "Why?" the girl asked. "Because symbols matter. Because a child holding a lantern in daylight is strange enough to draw attention. Because when people ask why you're there and what you're carrying, you can tell them, 'I'm here to shed light on what's been hidden.'" Readiness replaced panic. They had a plant in, desperate, dependent on timing and courage and the hope that truth would find its voice when the moment demanded. "Tomorrow, then," old Josh said. "Tomorrow," Reverend Matthews agreed. "Dawn, the execution yard. We stand for truth, and we trust that heaven hears what earth tries to silence." Friday dawn came cold and clear. The girl woke before first light, her stomach tight with nerves that felt like sickness. Around her, the quarters were still quiet, people sleeping through the last hour before the work bell rang. She dressed in her cleanest shift, the dark one that wouldn't show dirt if she had to kneel or run. She tied her bracelet, the one with the ribbon hidden inside, tight around her wrist. She picked up the lantern Reverend Matthews had given her and held it by the handle, testing its weight. Not heavy, old, familiar, like something that had been waiting for this moment. Outside, old Josh was already up, waiting near the barn. His face was set, determined, showing none of the fear he must have felt. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." They walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward town. The execution was scheduled for full sunrise, early enough that workers could attend before heading to fields and factories, late enough that the light would be good and the crowd could see clearly. Reverend Matthews met them at the church. He carried a worn leather satchel that held the Bible with the margin clause and whatever other proof he'd managed to gather. "Clerk?" old Josh asked. "No word. Haven't seen him. But we go forward either way." They walked together through the waking town. Shops were still closed, houses dark, but people were beginning to emerge, drawn by curiosity, by duty, by the spectacle of public execution that broke the monotony of hard work and harder lives. The execution yard sat behind the courthouse, a packed dirt space surrounded by a low fence. The gallows dominated the center, 3 beams raised vertical, crossbeam horizontal, 3 nooses hanging like punctuation marks at the end of an unjust sentence. Already, a crowd was forming: townspeople, plantation owners, overseers and patrollers, the magistrate who'd pronounce sentence, officials from the courthouse, and, scattered among them, enslaved people whose owners had given them permission to attend or who'd simply come because witnessing mattered, because seeing what happened to those who spoke truth was its own form of testimony. The girl, old Josh, and Reverend Matthews positioned themselves near the front, off to one side, where they could see clearly and be seen in turn. The girl held her unlit lantern. People glanced at it curiously. Why would a child carry a lantern in daylight? But no one asked. Not yet. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky pink and orange. Birds sang, oblivious to what was about to happen. The crowd grew thicker, pressing closer, voices rising in a murmur that sounded like water moving over stones. Then the pastors were brought out. 3 men in chains, flanked by guards. Their faces were calm, resolved. They'd spent the week in prayer and preparation, and whatever fear they felt was buried beneath something stronger: faith that death wasn't the end, that truth outlasted rope and air and the cruelty of men who feared what they couldn't control. Reverend William's sister Sarah's husband caught sight of his wife in the crowd. Their eyes met. He nodded once. She nodded back. No words, just acknowledgement. Love that didn't need speaking. The magistrate stood on a raised platform beside the gallows. He unrolled a document, the formal sentence, and began to read aloud. For the crime of unlawful assembly, for teaching slaves to read in violation of statute, for preaching doctrines deemed dangerous to public order, these men are condemned to hang by the neck until dead. Sentence to be carried out this day at sunrise by order of the governor and authority of this court. His voice was flat, administrative, like he was reading a ledger entry instead of pronouncing death. The pastors were led up the gallows steps. The nooses were placed around their necks. The crowd fell silent, that particular hush that comes when violence is about to erupt and everyone holds their breath waiting. The girl's hand tightened on the lantern handle. This was the moment, the point of no return. She began to hum, so soft at first that only those nearest could hear. The hymn from the quarters, the song Sister Sarah had taught her. The melody that mapped safe roads and marked dangerous crossings and carried hope through darkness. When darkness falls and fear takes hold. Beside her, Reverend Matthews picked up the melody, his voice joining hers. Then old Josh, his rough bass adding depth. People in the crowd began to turn, looking for the source of the sound. The magistrate paused, irritated by the disruption. Silence, he barked. But the girl kept humming, kept the tempo steady. And more voices joined Sister Sarah's, clear and strong despite her grief. Other members of the condemned pastor's congregations. People who knew the hymn, people who understood what it meant. The sound grew, rose, filled the yard like water filling a cup. The magistrate's face went red. I said silence. Guards, remove those people. And then the sky cracked open. Lightning split the dawn, brilliant, deafening, impossibly bright. It struck the gallows dead center, hitting the crossbeam with a sound like the world breaking. Wood exploded. The beam split clean in half. Splinters flew like shrapnel. The structure collapsed not all at once, but in stages, each piece falling away until nothing was left but charred posts and scattered rope. The pastors fell to the ground, still chained but untouched by the blast. The nooses lay in the dirt, severed and smoking. Smoke rose from the shattered gallows, thick and acrid, and for a moment no one moved. No one breathed. The crowd stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Terror flipped to awe. People stumbled back. Some fell to their knees, some made signs against evil. Others simply stared, mouths open, unable to form words. The magistrate's face had gone white. His hands shook as he dropped the sentencing document. Captain Reeves, the patroller who'd stopped the girl on the road, drew his pistol, then lowered it, realizing there was no one to shoot, no enemy to fight, just lightning and shattered wood and 3 men lying alive in the dirt. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, the girl lifted her lantern high. Still unlit, still just a battered piece of metal and glass, but held like a torch in daylight, visible to everyone in the yard. Every eye turned toward her. And then another figure stepped forward from the bend in the road behind the yard. The missing clerk, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His coat was dusty from travel, his face was pale, drawn, showing the cost of the decision he'd made. But his hands were steady as he carried a wooden box and a leather satchel stuffed with papers. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking but carrying across the yard. "Stop this execution." The magistrate recovered first, his face going from white to red with anger. "Who are you to interrupt?" "I'm James Morrison," the clerk said, his voice stronger now. "Circuit clerk for this district, and this execution is unlawful." The charges were brought under forged documents. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring. The magistrate's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "That's a serious accusation," he said carefully. "It's a provable fact." Fear broke into confession. The clerk had made his choice, had decided that living with the knowledge that he'd let 3 innocent men hang was worse than whatever threats had been made against him and his family. He walked through the crowd to the platform where the magistrate stood. He set the wooden box on the edge and opened it. Inside were 2 wax seals. "This one," he said, holding up the bright red seal so everyone could see, "is official, circuit court seal, used on all legal documents filed with this courthouse." He raised the other seal darker, duller. "Wrong. This one is not, it's a forgery. The wax color is different, the impression is slightly off, and it's being used to create false documents all over this district." He pulled the charging documents from his satchel, the papers that had condemned the 3 pastors, and held them up. "These documents bear the forged seal, not the official one. Under law, that makes them void. The charges are fraudulent. These men should never have been condemned. The crowd erupted. Voices rose, some angry, some confused, some demanding answers. The magistrate tried to speak over the noes. This is absurd. The documents were filed properly. They were filed. The clerk interrupted, but not properly. Look at the seal. He held the charging documents close to the magistrate's face, pointing at the wax impression. Then he held up the official seal for comparison. The difference was visible even from a distance: bright red versus dark red, clean impression versus slightly blurred, official versus forged. The magistrate's face went through several expressions: confusion, realization, then carefully controlled anger as he understood that he'd been used, that someone had manipulated him into pronouncing a death sentence based on fraudulent papers. Who forged these? Someone in the crowd shouted. I don't know all the names, the clerk said, but I know there's a ledger, a private record that shows how this forgery system has been used: doubled debts to justify sales, false charges to silence preachers, passes issued under fake authority. He pulled out a smaller ledger from his satchel, his own record, kept secretly over months of watching and documenting. This ledger shows discrepancies, entries that don't match the official courthouse records, seals that don't match the official stamp, a pattern of fraud designed to give certain people power over documents that should be beyond their reach. Pages fluttered in the morning air as he turned them, showing entry after entry where numbers didn't bounce, where seals were wrong, where authority had been forged. Anger turned toward justice. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. People began demanding answers, demanding to see the ledgers, demanding to know who was responsible. The girl stepped forward then, still holding her lantern. She walked through the crowd, people parting to let her pass, until she stood beside the clerk's platform. I have proof too, she said. Her voice was small, but in the shocked silence following the lightning strike canned the clerk's confession. It carried. Every eye turned to her, a slave child, barefoot, holding an unlit lantern like it was the most important thing in the world. She reached into her bracelet and pulled out the ribbon with the forged seal impression. The same ribbon Reverend Matthews had given her. The same dark red wax that didn't match the official seal. She held it up so everyone could see. I found this at the plantation office, she said clearly. The wax color matches the forged seal, not the official one. I've seen both, and they're different. The clerk took the ribbon and examined it, then held it next to the forged seal in his box. The match was obvious. She's right, he confirmed. This ribbon bears the same forged seal impression. Captain Reeves, the patroller who'd questioned her on the road, pushed through the crowd. His face was conflicted, caught between duty and the dawning realization that he'd been enforcing fraudulent documents. How would a slave child know about seal colors? He demanded. The girl looked at him steadily. Because I carry messages, I see documents, I notice things. The courthouse seal is bright red, always has been. When I saw darker wax, I knew something was wrong, and you said nothing. I said something to you, sir, on the road. I told you the official seal was bright red. I told you any other color meant the paper wasn't legal. Captain Reeves's face went through several emotions as he remembered that conversation. He dismissed it then, thought she was just a child speaking out of turn. Now he realized she'd been warning him, telling him he'd been waving through forged documents, testing to see if he'd noticed the discrepancy. He'd failed the test. Reverend Matthews stepped forward next, his leather satchel in hand. There's more. Written proof that these men should have been protected. He pulled out the plantation owner's Bible and opened it to the Exodus margin. The crowd pressed closer, trying to see. This is a protection clause, Reverend Matthews said, written and signed by the plantation owner 3 years ago. It specifically names these 3 pastors and grants them protection to preach, provided their words are witnessed by proper authority under the official seal. He read the clause aloud, his voice carrying across the yard. Protection is granted to those who preach truth without rebellion, provided their words are witnessed by proper authority under seal of the circuit clerk, bright red. Official stamp, no deviation permitted. Any charge brought under false papers bearing wrong seal is void and punishable as fraud. The crowd leaned closer. The magistrate's expression shifted from anger to careful calculation as he realized the legal ground was crumbling beneath him. The clause specifically requires the official seal, Reverend Matthews continued. Bright red, no deviation. The charging documents use the wrong seal. Therefore, under the owner's own written word, the charges are void. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Where's the owner? Let him confirm it." The plantation owner was in the crowd, weak still from his fever, but present. His wife had brought him, thinking he should witness the execution of men he'd once protected. Now he stood, shaking slightly, supported by his wife's arm. "It's true," he said, his voice hoarse but clear enough. "I wrote that clause years ago, before things got complicated, before debts got tight and pressure came from the governor's office." He paused, gathering strength. "The clause stands. These men were supposed to be protected. Whoever used the forged seal to charge them committed fraud. The charges are void." The crowd erupted again. This time the anger had a clear direction toward whoever had forged the documents, whoever had manipulated the system, whoever had tried to murder 3 men using false authority. The overseer from the girls' plantation who'd been standing at the edge of the crowd suddenly turned and tried to leave. But people blocked his path. "Where you going?" someone demanded. "Let me through, I've got business." "You're the one who filed those charges," Captain Reeves said, his voice hard. "I remember now, you brought the papers to my office. Said they were urgent. Said the governor wanted it done quickly." The overseer's face, tail. "I was following orders." "Whose orders?" "I don't. I can single quotes but his guilt was written plain on his face. He'd been part of it. Maybe not the architect, but a tool used to silence men whose preaching threat and the established order." The magistrate, seeing which way the wind was blowing, made a decision. "Bring the ledgers, both of them. We'll compare the courthouse's official records to this private ledger the clerk has been keeping. We'll find every discrepancy, every forged seal, every fraudulent document." He looked at the 3 pastors, still lying on the ground where they'd fallen, still chained. "Release them. Now, under authority of the evidence presented, the charges are void. These men are free pending full investigation." Guards moved forward and unlocked the chains. The pastors stood slowly, rubbing their wrists, looking dazed like men who'd prepared to die and suddenly found themselves alive. The girl began to hum again, softly. The hymn that had started everything. Sister Sarah's voice joined hers first, then Reverend Matthew's, then old Josh, then others, in the crowd dozens of voices, then scores, rising together in a sound that felt like prayer and protest and relief all woven into one melody. "When darkness falls and fear takes hold, remember breath is steady gold. Count the bells until they rest, then move when silence serves you best. When the door is barred and hope seems gone, look for light that carries on. Double quotes. The hymn filled the execution yard, rolling over the shattered gallows and the scattered ropes and the officials who stood uncertain what to do next. Enemies fell silent or slipped away. Those who remained, those who weren't guilty, who'd simply been deceived, stood and listened to the song that had mapped safe roads and carried hope through impossible darkness. Division gave way to shared breath. The magistrate, who'd been ready to hang 3 men, stood silent and let the hymn wash over him. His face showed something that might have been shame or might have been relief that he hadn't actually killed innocent people. The hymn rose into the open sky, and the morning light turned everything gold. The broken gallows, the scattered crowd, the 3 pastors standing free with tears running down their faces. The girl kept humming, her voice steady, and felt the rhythm in her chest where it had lived since that first night in the corridors when Sister Sarah had taught her that songs could carry more than melody, that truth could hide in plain sound, waiting for ears that knew how to listen. The courthouse steps became an impromptu courtroom as the morning wore on. Tables were brought out, the official ledger was retrieved from the clerk's office. James Morrison's private ledger was laid beside it for comparison. Officials pored over the documents while the crowd watched. The discrepancies were obvious once someone looked closely. Entries that appeared in Morrison's ledger, but not the official one. Debt amounts that had been doubled, passes issued with the wrong seal. Charges filed under fraudulent authority. The pattern was clear. Someone or several someones had been using forged seals to manipulate the legal system, to profit from debt, to silence opposition, to maintain power through false documents. The girl stood to the side with old Josh and Reverend Matthews, still holding her lantern, watching as truth unfolded in the morning light. Captain Reeves approached her. His face was troubled, conflicted. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "You tried to tell me about the seals. I didn't listen." "You listen now," the girl said simply. "I do. And I'll make sure other patrollers know to check seal colors, to compare documents to the official stamp before enforcing them." He paused. "How did you learn to see the difference?" "I didn't learn. I just noticed. Noticed that some seals were bright and some were dull. Notice that the dull ones appeared on documents that seemed wrong, that hurt people who shouldn't be hurt. You're observant, I have to be. People like me don't get second chances, we make mistakes. Captain Reeves nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of that. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't pay attention. Sorry I enforced documents I should have questioned. Then do better, the girl said. That's how sorry works. You do better next time. He nodded again and walked away, his shoulders set differently, like he'd decided something about the kind of patroller he wanted to be. By noon, the magistrate had made his ruling. Standing on the courthouse steps with the crowd still assembled, he read from a quickly drafted order. Based on evidence presented this day, the charges against Reverend Josiah Williams, Reverend Marcus Green, and Reverend Samuel Thomas are hereby declared void. The documents used to charge these men bore forged seals and do not carry the authority of this court or the governor's office. He paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, an investigation is ordered into all documents filed in this district over the past 2 years. Any document bearing the forged seal will be reviewed and potentially void. Any person found to have knowingly used forged seals for personal gain or to harm others will be charged with fraud and face appropriate punishment. The crowd murmured approval. Justice, real justice, not the kind that hanged innocent men, was being served. The plantation owner's protection clause is recognized as legal and binding. These 3 pastors are granted full protection to preach within the bounds of law, and any future charges must be brought under proper authority with verified documentation. The magistrate looked at the 3 pastors who stood together at the base of the steps. You are free, with apologies from this court for the error that nearly cost your lives. Reverend Williams stepped forward. It wasn't error, Your Honor. It was deliberate fraud. Someone wanted us silenced, wanted our voices stopped. I understand that. And the investigation will seek to discover who. We forgive them anyway, Reverend Williams said quietly, not because what they did was acceptable, but because holding hatred is too heavy a burden to carry. The magistrate nodded, though he looked uncomfortable with the idea of forgiving people who'd nearly committed murder through legal manipulation. James Morrison, the clerk, was called forward. He'd been sitting on the courthouse steps, exhausted, his courage spent now that the crisis had passed. You did the right thing, the magistrate told him, coming forward, bringing the proof. It took courage, it took too long, Morrison said bitterly. I knew about the forgeries for months, I documented them but didn't speak. I was afraid. Fear is understandable. Fear is not an excuse. 3 men almost died because I was too scared to stand. The magistrate didn't argue with that. What made you come today? What changed? Morrison looked at the girl still standing to the side with her unlit lantern. A child knew the difference between right and wrong wax. A child spoke truth when grown men stayed silent. If she could find courage, I had no excuse for cowardice. He pulled out his official seal, the bright red one, clean and proper, and a fresh sheet of paper. I'm certifying the protection clause, making it part of the official record. Anyone who wants to challenge these pastors in the future will have to go through proper channels with proper documentation. No more forged papers, no more shortcuts around justice. He wrote quickly, his hand steady now that the decision was made. When he finished, he pressed the seal into bright red wax. The imprint bloomed clean and sharp, official, undeniable, correct. He signed it, dated it, held it up for the crowd to see. This is what legitimate authority looks like, he said. Bright red wax, clean impression, signatures that match official records. Anything else is fraud, and I'll call it out from now on. Relief flooded through the assembled crowd. People who'd been holding their breath for hours finally exhaled. Children who'd been forced to stand still finally moved, running and playing at the edges of the gathering. Sister Sarah pushed through the crowd to her husband. She'd been standing silent all morning, her face showing nothing, but now tears ran freely as she reached him. They held each other without speaking. No words were big enough for what they'd just survived. The other 2 pastors were greeted by their families in similar fashion. Relief and joy mixed with the knowledge of how close death had come, how narrow the margin between living and dying had been. Reverend Matthews began to sing, not the coded hymn this time, but a hymn of thanksgiving. Old words, familiar melody, the kind sung in churches across the country on Sundays when everything was normal and good. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Double quotes. Voices joined, first a few, then dozens, then the whole crowd. Even people who'd come expecting an execution. even officials who'd been part of the system that nearly killed 3 innocent men. The hymn rose into the afternoon air, and the broken gallows still smoldering slightly from the lightning strike stood as a monument to the moment when heaven spoke and earth had to listen. Division gave way to shared breath, not reconciliation. Exactly, the wounds were too fresh, the injustice too deep for easy healing. But acknowledgement, recognition that something had shifted, that truth had been told and heard and acted upon. The girl stood listening, her lantern finally set down at her feet. Her role was finished. She'd carried the proof, named the seal color, stood visible when visibility mattered. Now the work belonged to others, to clerks who would verify documents, to magistrates who would investigate fraud, to patrollers who would check seals before enforcing papers, to communities who would remember that justice required vigilance and courage and the willingness to speak even when speaking was dangerous. Plans were made quickly. The 3 pastors couldn't stay in the district. Too many people had too much invested in keeping them silent, and not everyone would accept the void charges gracefully. "There's a congregation to counties north," Reverend Matthews said. "They'll welcome you, give you time to recover, keep you safe while things settle here. We should leave soon," Reverend Williams said. Before anyone decides to ignore the magistrate's ruling, wagons were ready. Supplies gathered. Morrison wrote travel passes with the official seal bright red, clean, impossible to challenge legally. The girl watched the preparations with old Josh beside her. Her part in this was done, but the pastor's journey was just beginning. Sister Sarah came over and knelt in front of the girl. "You saved my husband's life, saved all 3 of them. I just noticed things," the girl said. "Just paid attention. That's more than most people do. Most people look but don't see, hear but don't listen." Sister Sarah touched the girl's cheek gently. "You're going to do great things, child. This is just the beginning. I don't want to do great things. I just want people to be safe. That's what makes you special. You don't do it for glory. You do it because it needs doing." Sister Sarah stood and pressed something into the girl's hand. A small wooden cross, carved smooth, worn from years of handling. "My mother gave this to me," she said. "Now I'm giving it to you. Not because you need it for faith, you've got plenty of that already. But so you remember this day, remember that standing for truth matters. Remember that even small voices carry weight when they speak clearly." The girl closed her fingers around the cross. It was warm from Sister Sarah's hand. Solid, real. "Thank you," she whispered. By afternoon, the wagons were loaded. The 3 pastors climbed aboard, still looking dazed like men who'd prepared to die and couldn't quite believe they were alive. Families climbed up with them, children, wives, a few congregants who decided to go north rather than stay in a place where forgery had nearly led to murder. Before they left, Reverend Williams called the girl over. "What's your name, child?" she told him quietly. He repeated it, committing it to memory. "I won't forget," he said. "When I preach again, and I will preach again, I'll tell this story. I'll tell them about lightning that split gallows, about a clerk who found courage, about a child who held an unlit lantern and shed light anyway." The girl didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. The wagons rolled out, wheels creaking, heading north toward safety and new beginnings. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in low voices, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Lightning without storm clouds, a gallows destroyed at the moment of execution. Truth spoken in time to save lives. Some called it miracle, some called it providence. Some called it coincidence and luck. The girl called it paying attention. Noticing things, speaking up when speaking mattered, standing visible when everyone expected her to disappear. She walked back toward the plantation with Reverend Matthews and old Josh. The day was hot now, the sun high, and the earlier drama felt distant, like something that had happened in a dream. "What happens now?" old Josh asked. Reverend Matthews shrugged. "Same as always, work, pray, watch for the next time truth needs speaking. Watch for the next forged seal, the next fraudulent document, the next person who needs help navigating a system designed to cheat them." And the hymn keeps going, keeps teaching, keeps mapping safe roads for people who need them. He glanced at the girl. "You'll remember the verses?" "Every one," she said, "every pause, every direction. Good, because others will need it. Others will need someone who can hum steady when danger is close and the path unclear." They walked in silence for a while. Then Reverend Matthews began to hum softly, almost absent-mindedly. The girl joined. Then old Josh, his rough bass adding depth. The hymn carried them home, As the sun climbed toward afternoon and the day settled into something like peace. That evening, the quarters held a gathering. Not a celebration, exactly 3 men had almost died. And that wasn't something to celebrate, but an acknowledgement, a collective exhale. A moment to recognize that something had shifted, that truth had been told and heard and acted upon. Someone brought out a pot of soup thin but warm. Someone else had cornbread left from the midday meal. The children ran between the cabins, laughing for the first time in days, their parents watching with tired smiles. They sang, not just the coded hymn, but other songs too. Songs of sorrow and hope, songs that named pain without being crushed by it, songs that imagined freedom even when it seemed impossible. The girl sat on the steps of her cabin, her bare feet in the dust, her hands folded in her lap. The lantern sat beside her still unlit, still waiting for the next time it would be needed. The wooden cross Sister Sarah had given her hung around her neck on a piece of string. She touched it occasionally, feeling its smooth surface, remembering the woman who taught her the coded hymn and the morning when that hymn had helped save 3 lives. Old Josh sat beside her. You did good today, child, we did good, she corrected. All of us together, fair enough. But you started it, you noticed the wrong wax. You found the margin clause, you stood visible when it mattered. I was scared, everyone was scared. Difference is, you acted anyway. The girl considered this. Is that what courage is, acting even when you're scared? That's exactly what courage is. Brave people aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel it and move forward anyway. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the singing, watching the sun paint the sky orange and pink as it set behind the cabins. In the distance far beyond the plantation, beyond the town, beyond the courthouse with its newly verified documents, the broken gallows stood empty. Charred wood, severed ropes, a monument to the moment when lightning spoke and justice answered. But the girl didn't look that direction. She looked at the people around her singing, eating, holding children, simply being together in a moment of relative safety. This was what mattered. Not the drama of lightning strikes and public confrontations, but the quiet work of noticing things, speaking truth, standing visible, and trusting that enough small voices raised together could shift even the heaviest weights. Aunt Ruth came over and sat on the steps with them. She'd been tending sick children all day and looked exhausted, but her face showed satisfaction. Heard what happened at the execution yard, she said. You weren't there, the girl asked. Had 3 babies with croup. Couldn't leave them, but word travels fast, she smiled. Lightning struck the gallows at the exact moment of hanging. Pastors fell safely. Child with a lantern stood visible until truth came forward. That about right, more or less, old Josh said. People are calling it miracle. People can call it what they want, the girl said. I call it timing, courage, enough people refusing to stay silent, and Ruth nodded. That's miracle enough for me. Don't need burning bushes and parted seas when you got ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Made you something for carrying that lantern when it needs carrying again. Inside the bundle was a strap leather, braided, with hooks on each end. A shoulder strap for the lantern so the girl's hands could be free while still keeping the light visible. In case next time you need to carry truth and hold something else at the same time, Aunt Ruth explained. The girl took the strap, her throat tight. Thank you, don't thank me. Just keep seeing what needs seeing, keep speaking what needs speaking. Keep standing when everyone expects you to sit. Night fell fully. Stars came out thick, bright, and dimmed by city lights. The singing continued, softer now, winding down as people prepared for sleep and the work that would come with tomorrow's dawn. The girl lay on her pallet, the wooden cross under her shirt against her skin, the lantern strap folded carefully beside her pillow. Outside, she could hear the last of the singing fading into silence. She thought about the morning, about lightning and gallows, about seals and ledgers and the way truth had fought its way into daylight despite every attempt to bury it. She thought about James Morrison, the clerk who'd finally found courage, about Captain Reeves, who'd apologized and promised to do better, about the magistrate who'd admitted error and ordered investigation, about the 3 pastors who'd forgiven their would-be murderers even while recognizing the attempted murder for what it was. She thought about Sister Sarah teaching the coded hymn, about Reverend Matthews gathering proof in secret, about old Josh walking 3 miles in darkness because a child needed witness, about Aunt Ruth making a lantern strap for carrying truth. Small acts, ordinary people, extraordinary outcomes when enough small acts align. The girl closed her eyes and let sleep come, knowing that tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new moments, when someone would need to notice things and speak up and stand visible. But tonight, 3 men who should have died were alive and traveling toward safety. Tonight, forged documents had been exposed and truth had been verified. Tonight, the broken gallows stood empty as proof that justice, however delayed and imperfect, could still prevail when enough people refused to accept lies as law. The hymn hummed quietly in the back of her mind, not sung aloud, but present anyway, ready to be called upon when needed. When darkness falls and fear takes hold, remember breath is steady gold. Count the bells until they rest, then move when silence serves you best. When the door is barred and hope seems gone, look for light that carries on. And in the morning, when the work bell rang and the day began again, the girl would rise and carry water and pull weeds and notice things and speak, when speaking mattered, just another child doing the work assigned to her, holding truth quietly until the moment came to make it loud. The broken gallows stood empty behind them, and the stars turned overhead, and the night held its breath before giving way to dawn.